A few days ago, as I was putting together the message for today, I found myself wanting to enter deep waters. There's this image from the book of Psalms that says, "Deep calls out to deep." And I found myself going there and enjoying it, because it is from the sense of entering deep waters that I can somehow get a little bit of a vantage point. Take a look at the big picture, if you may. And so much about this day, the last day of the year, and the festivities and the carousing that goes with it, is at the surface. So much of it doesn't really go far at all, that I figured that if there was ever a day to enter deep waters, it would be on the last Sunday of the year. And so I pray that the words from my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts are acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Grace and peace be with you on this day.
And also with you.
So the last day of the year lends itself as a contemplative moment in our hurried and busy lives. It's a day to look at the list of famous people who died in 2023 and to marvel about their contributions to humanity. I'm thinking about Tina Turner and Rosalind Carter, in case you're wondering. Two women that have a lot more in common than you might think. It's also a day when a few people sing a very peculiar song. And I use the words peculiar in case you don't know me. I come from Cuban American heritage. And so this song, Auld Lang Syne, is one that I have always found very peculiar. And I watch the people as they all start to sing it, and then I watch many more others pretend to know the lyrics. December 31st is a natural day to practice some introspective skills and ask, what did I learn? While also looking forward and asking, so what do I hope for? It's from such contemplative questions that people develop New Year's resolutions. Normally, I have to ask my wife what my resolutions should be. She is full of suggestions. Now, I have a natural inclination for the introspective contemplation. It's one of those traits that most pastors tend to have with a few exceptions. And 2023 was one of those years when I spent more time in self-analysis than usual. To help with the introspective questions, I decided to reread several books and relearn the lessons. For you see, I have this tendency of holding on to books that I think are useful. I have this tendency of having books in my very small library that I do not lend out, and I do not donate, and I don't throw away, because I have this nagging feeling that one day I just may have to read them all over again. And 2023 was one of those years. I found myself perusing through my bookshelves, and out of the many books, I only want to mention two. I had in my hand for a good portion of the year letters from a Birmingham jail by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And then I also had in my hand a book about organizational psychology by a Dr. James Carse called Finite and Infinite Games. And I found these two books to be invaluable in reframing my daily approach to the challenges that we just lived. I want to begin with Dr. Carse and his book, Finite and Infinite Games. He divides humanity into two categories, finite and infinite. And he states that we are people that are either involved in finite goals and thinking in finite terms, or we might be reaching for the infinite goals and think in infinite images. Now, we have finite games that we're all very familiar with, like soccer, football, or basketball. These games have rules. They have a starting time and they have an end time. The clock is in control because at the end of the game, there is a winner and there is a loser. Now, someone may plead for more time. Someone may argue that if they only had 5 more minutes, they would win. But that's not how the game works. A finite player is playing to win, and they follow the clock. Whereas an infinite player is playing to keep the game alive. The clock is not in charge. Music to my Latin ears. The clock has no relevance here. Things begin when they're going to begin, and things will end at the natural time to end. And there are no winners and there are no losers. Only goals are achieved, and goals are achieved not because the clock says it's time to achieve the goals, but because everything was met. And if the goal is not met, then the infinite player is still in the game and just has to try all over again. He or she is not called a loser for not having met the goal. He or she is given another chance to go ahead and do it all over again. Now, Russia and Ukraine are playing a game. If we can think of that war along those terms. And I don't want to diminish all the lives that have been lost by calling it a game, but just go with me for this one. They are playing a game, but the difference is that Russia is playing a finite game. Russia is a finite player, whereas Ukraine is an infinite one. Vladimir Putin wants to declare victory by annexing land, whereas the Ukrainians are in a struggle. And however long it takes, they will stay in that struggle. And our nation, the United States, we're spectators in this struggle, but we have a finite mindset determined, and it's determined by how much money we're willing to spend. Our funds have a limit. And when we reach that limit, that finite limit, we just might turn our backs and pretend that the war is not happening anymore. We will stop rooting for a winner. And then there's time. How we approach time, some of us approach it in finite ways, some of us approach it in infinite ways. The concept of time is interpreted differently by each player. Finite players like to divide time into periods and declare winners and losers for each era. It's very theatrical. Each period of time is like a scene with its own opening and closing of curtains, and they see time as something that can be lost. Infinite players interpret time as something that is generated. We say things like, "I'll make time for you." Time does not pass for an infinite player. Each moment of time is a new beginning. There is no such thing as an hour of time. There is only an hour of love, or a day of grieving, or a season of learning, or a year of labor. Instead of stating how much has been completed in their work, infinite players acknowledge that there's still much work left to be done. A young woman on her 18th birthday took a trip to the West Coast and told her parents that she would be back in 6 weeks. The parents waved at her as she pulled out of the driveway in her Chevy Caprice. It was a moment in time where the infinite and the finite intersected. Her parents were full of finite expectations, and the young woman was bursting with infinite possibilities. As you might expect, the young woman did not return 6 weeks later. She made a new life out in the West Coast at the disappointment of her parents, who were holding on to her eventual return. The infinite player knows how to let go, The finite player holds on. The infinite player knows that time is a construct. The infinite player knows that today, the 31st day of the 12th month, 2023 years of the common era, is a construct of finite thinking. Much of the language that will be used tonight at the many, many gatherings as we watch the ball in Times Square descend will be finite at its core. Just listen to the commentators talk, and you will hear finite languages evaluating what has been, evaluating what will be. Yet time for the Christian church is no longer relevant. Our new year begins with the first Sunday of Advent, and notice the language that we use on that day. It's all about the hope that tomorrow brings. The Christian church is a prime example of infinite thinking. No pastor plants a church thinking of time. Churches are planted for longevity, to endure through the generations. And yet too often it is finite thinking that determines if they are successful or not. The success of a worship service is often measured in the number of people who attend. The success of a pastor is often measured in the amount of money he is able to raise. And yet neither attendance nor monetary funds determine how close we walk to God. Christian theology is full of infinite thinking and imagery. Easter being the ultimate image to break us away from finite limitations. It is at Easter that we hear those words that death is not the end, but rather a new beginning. And the same goes for birth. It is through a child's birth that we realize something larger is at work, a mystery that connects us with the divine. And so when the church celebrates the birth of Jesus on Christmas Eve, we read from the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And we refer to a village from long ago, Bethlehem, as a symbol of hope for us today. Think about it. So much has changed. Why would we look back 2,000 years to a small village, agricultural and anachronistic in so many ways, Bethlehem, and have it as a symbol of hope? And it's because of what happened in that village that transcended time. It's what happened that still has an impact on us and on our life today. It's because it is through Bethlehem that we get a glimpse of the infinite. The other infinite player I want to reference is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'd like to remind you of a speech that was beautiful, and so many of us only know the snippets. His I Have a Dream speech, and also his I Have Seen the Mountaintop speech. If you were to go back and read those passages, you will find that they are full of infinite images. He used hope as the vehicle for his strategy. He described the work of fighting injustice and racism in metaphors that transcend all limitations. And it is the work that will lead a nation to judge children by their character and not the color of their skin. It is work that will lead people to realize injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. End of quote. Dr. King sought to teach a new concept of community, one that is not bound by the laws of finite limitations. We are tied up in an infinite network of mutuality. The behavior of one person affects the entire community. Let me take you back to the year 1902. Just a few days before Christmas Eve, there were two early settlers of Pass-A-Grille Beach, a man known as Doc Roberts and a hotel owner, George Lazat. And they invited families from distant city, now known as Gulfport, to join them at Pass-A-Grille Beach for a Christmas celebration. And by mid-morning Christmas Eve, a stately pine tree cut from the neighboring Cabbage Key, now known as Terra Verde, stood adorned with shimmering glass bells, tinsel garland, and candles of all hues of the rainbow. It was Pass-A-Grille's first Christmas tree. In 1910, a year before Pass-A-Grille was incorporated, a small group gathered around another Christmas tree over at the schoolhouse, which is now a museum. And that was the unofficial beginning of our church. Funds were raised starting in that year, 1910, culminating all the way through 1917, because it was in 1917 when the property was finally built. Those early settlers and church founders, they understood infinite thinking. Their vision for a church on this island was not bound by the limitations of finite rules. It was the hope and promise of infinite possibilities that led them to establish this church. And here we are, generations later, reaping the benefits of their vision. A visionary man whose passage we just read, the Apostle Paul, he too was an infinite player. He understood the endless possibilities of a faithful and worshiping community. In his letter to the Colossians, he described the virtues that we must adopt as a worshiping community, that we must adopt in our Christian living. Clothe yourself with love. Clothe yourself with love. Why love? Out of all the different virtues he could have spoken about, why love? Well, had he used patience, he knew that there's a limit to our patience. There's a limit to so many of the virtues that we have, but love is the one that is limitless. Love is eternal. It has no boundaries. We could feel the love of our spouses long after they have passed. Love not only transforms, but it transcends, because it has no beginning and it has no end. Love, like God, is infinite, which is why the Apostle John said that God is love. And we have the benefit of experiencing love, of experiencing God. So on this last day of the 12th month in the year 2023 of the Common Era, I invite you to go into deep waters. I invite you to get a vantage point that will give you the big picture. I invite you to sit at the intersection between the limitations of the finite and the possibilities of the infinite. And get a little bit introspective. Ask yourself a question. What limitations are you holding on to? What is keeping you from experiencing the fullness of God's love? What language constrains your thinking? In this new year, 2024, realize that the eternal is within our reach through the Spirit of the living God. Become part of the church, not because we can measure the work before us in finite terms, but because through Christ, the work of the church yields infinite fruit for an immeasurable and unknowable time. This is the meaning of Christmas. To see the birth of the Christ child as a new beginning in a long journey of all that can be possible. The possibilities are endless. Amen.